So deployment is all about moving our metadata around. Production orgs are our runtime environments. And we're going to be doing development of our Apex code and our Visualforce pages in our sandboxes, right? Now, to create a sandbox is really easy. It's one of the first things that we did on class on Monday. You simply go down there, data management, sandbox, kick it off, and then the system takes care of creating that copy for you. Now, to get your changes back into your production environment, it's not that simple, because you need to identify, well, what are the things that I want to apply or to promote into that production environment, okay? And the mechanism by which we promote those changes back into our production environment is deployment, okay? So here is a sample of a number of sandboxes, and then these indicate sort of a process that would occur in order to get changes into those production environments. Over on the left-hand side, we have a couple of developer sandboxes. So we have maybe a couple of developers or a couple of teams of developers. And so what we're going to do is those two teams of developers are working in their separate sandboxes, and ultimately as a part of a release, we're going to combine their changes into a single copy, and we're going to deploy that to an integration sandbox. So that's our second sandbox in the chain, which is taking their two inputs. We're probably going to run our tests again, make sure that Team A didn't break anything that Team B did, and vice versa. Make sure, just some sanity tests. And then we're going to ultimately promote this into a staging environment. Now at this point, maybe we're doing some load testing. Maybe our end users are signing off on what has been created. Maybe we're doing something where we could actually do some training. So before we promote it into production, we could either use this staging environment as a training environment, or we could actually create a separate sandbox for the purpose of training. And then ultimately, we're going to promote those changes into production, okay? So hopefully we have a stable release by the time we get there, and well-trained users. So when we perform that deployment, this is where we do those requirements, which is 75% of all your lines of Apex code, 100% of your triggers, and none of your tests can execute with an uncaught exception or a governor limit being exceeded. Okay. There are a number of different tools that we have to do the deployment. So we could use the Force.com IDE, which is what we're going to be using within our exercise. There's also change sets. Change sets, I'll talk about those. Those are a browser-based tool. Then we have the Force.com migration tool, which utilizes Ant, which is an Apache project. And then we have third-party tools. So because our metadata API is a publicly available API, that is still out there and available for our partners to use. And we have one called Dream Factory, who created a tool called Snapshot. And there might actually be a few more out there. The way that this works is you are going to go into your project. So if I have a project in my Force.com ID, I'm going to walk you through this with the Force.com ID. You would right-click on either your project, or you could actually right-click on a specific thing if that's all you wanted to deploy. But what you're going to do is you're going to select Deploy to Server from the Force.com menu down there. So remember, we had Refresh from Server, Save to Server, Synchronize with Server. We also have Deploy to Server. What's going to happen is it's going to prompt you for the credentials for accessing the target org that you're going to be deploying components to. It's going to prompt you to make an archive. Now, by default, the destination archive is checked, and the project archive is not. And the reason is that the destination archive, this is essentially a zip folder of your source directory of what you're about to overwrite. So in other words, if we're going to be deploying to production, that is the destination, and we are going to probably, I mean, in the real world, we're going to want to check that box to back up those definitions of the components that we are about to overwrite. The reason we need to do this is that when we do our deployment, there is no sort of undo other than to redeploy the old versions of the components back up to production. The project one, you can do this, but it's not really that necessary because you already have a local copy anyways, right? Deploying via the Force.com IDE, you can then validate what you're about to do. So what you're going to see is you're going to see within the Force.com IDE a list of all of the components that are in the project. The green color indicates that this is something that exists within the local project but not the target org. In other words, do you want to overwrite or do you want to add that definition? You're also going to see yellow. Yellow indicates that the component exists in both locations and there is a difference in the definition, so do you want to overwrite it? You'll see gray. Gray indicates that there's the component in your local project and then up in the destination org, but there's no difference. It did a diff and there's no difference, so you could overwrite it, but there's no point to that. And then the final one is red. Red indicates that it exists in the target org but not your project. Do you want to perhaps delete it? Okay. So what we're going to end up doing is we're going to check the boxes of the things that we would like to deploy, and then there's a validate deployment button. And what this is going to do is this is going to check the logic of what you're what you're attempting to deploy to make sure that it will, whether or not it will successfully deploy or not. Okay. Now, why would a deployment not succeed? What could possibly go wrong? Well, what could go wrong is throughout the product, there are many dependencies between different, your different types of metadata. So for instance, if you've ever created a queue, when you create a queue, the first thing it prompts you for is what objects do you want to associate this queue with? So if I'm going to create a queue and that queue is associated with an object that does not yet exist within my target org, that's a dependency that does, that's going to, or it's going to fail because of that dependency. Okay. The second thing that you're going to run into, and this is associated with the fact, or this is also associated with dependencies, is that the metadata API, so the metadata API does not cover every single piece of metadata, okay? And you can actually find this, so there are things which are not covered in the metadata API. A big one I would say is approval processes. So approval processes are not covered in the metadata API. So taking a look down here, in the metadata API developers guide, one of the things that they do is you can come out here and see all of the different metadata types. This list within the, within the table of contents, here are all the different metadata types that are supported, okay? So it's a pretty big list. But like I said, there's a few things which are not supported. Now in the documentation, there's also the list of the things which are not supported by the metadata API. So you can go through this list to see what those are. So if you have, for instance, once again, that approval process, it's always associated with an object type, then we could have some issues there. Okay. Now, what do you do if it's not supported by the metadata? Well, you're just going to need to manually recreate that thing. And so, for that reason, when it's, a lot of people, the thing that they do, if it's not something like Visualforce and Apex, I think people in the real world, they tend to just create those things in production. The great thing about an approval process is that you can create an inactive one. So you could create the definition, and then ultimately activate it so you're not negatively affecting anything. But for that reason, a lot of people will do a lot of those things just directly into production. The third issue that you're going to run into is you're going to run into org specific data in the metadata. You know, if you're doing an email alert, for instance, associated with a workflow action, you reference a user that you want to send that email to, and in your sandbox, so in our case, our sandbox is called devorg. So if I'm going to create a workflow rule email alert that references a user in my sandbox, what does every single username end with in our sandbox? Devorg, yeah. And what are there none of in our production environment? There are no users whose names end in devorg, okay? They all end in .com. So, there are a few situations where you're going to see org-specific data in your metadata. Now, it's not a big deal because when you click on that validate button, it's going to tell you, hey, there's no user called, you know, blah, 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 .devorg. And all you need to do is you can do something in the force.com IDE. One of the things that you can do is you can take your project offline and essentially disconnect it from the org that it's associated with. And so there's this force.com work offline. So you could go into that project, do a search and replace. Everywhere you see com.devorg, replace it with com, utilizing the, you know, a little script, or utilizing search and replace within within Eclipse, and then do the deployment. Now there's an advantage of utilizing so just going back to this list, one of the key advantages of using change sets is that it takes care of that for you. So they have the logic to, you know, to perform that conversion for you. So I'll talk briefly about change sets in an upcoming slide. But it's one of the key advantages of using change sets versus using force.com IDE or the Ant tool. Okay. So ultimately, what we're going to do is we're going to click on the next, and we're going to deploy our changes into our production environment, or into another sandbox, actually. Not just from sandbox to production, but sandbox to sandbox. All right. Now, for the things that I just mentioned, so back here, for the things that I just mentioned, the issues that you would run into with things that aren't covered in the metadata API, org-specific data or dependencies, one of the benefits to doing, for instance, the deployment from the integration sandbox to the staging sandbox is that you're going to learn about those issues. Because whatever issues that you're going to have going from sandbox to production at the end of the day, you're going to discover those when you go from integration to staging. Okay? And so part of doing this process is, you know, definitely doing the testing inside the sandbox, but also learning about the issues, or, you know, figuring out what you need to do in order to migrate that metadata from sandbox to sandbox, or sandbox to production, so that when you go from sandbox to production, you know about all the things that you're going to need to, all the little exceptions that you need to take care of. Okay? All right. All right, there's also a feature called change sets. You'll find this under the deploy area of your setup menu. What you do is you create this thing called a change set in the source org. You add some metadata components to that change set. You then upload it from the source environment to the target environment. You then would log into the target environment you're going to see an inbound change set, whereas when you're in the source orgs, it was an outbound change set. So once you've logged into, in this case, this is our testing sandbox, in the target org, you're going to then see the inbound change set, and you're going to deploy it into the production environment. So it's a multi-step process where you define the change set, you upload it, and then you log into the targeted environment, and then you deploy it. Okay? All right. The Force.com migration tool are some extensions to Ant, which is a Java-based utility that utilizes XML files to automate processes and scripts and so on. And so that's out there and available. You can download it from developer.force.com. Essentially, we've added 2 extensions to it, 2 actions, which is deploy, in other words, push metadata up to Salesforce, or retrieve, pull metadata down from Salesforce. Okay. And then Dream Factory Snapshot, it's a third-party tool. It is not free. A lot of customers like it though, because it gives you a nice comparison view. It also allows you to essentially save off a metadata archive as a snapshot, if you will. A lot of customers like it. So, all right, let's do some review questions around deployment. Why do you have to deploy your code into production? So what I'm going for here is that you can't write code in production. If you do have a Developer Edition account, you can do that. But for those of our customers who are using Enterprise and Unlimited Edition, they need to write their code in their sandboxes and then ultimately deploy it. We took a look at 4 tools, or talked about 4 tools, which we could use to do deployment. What were those 4 tools? IDE. Force.com IDE, very good. Ant, Force.com migration tool. Change sets, very good.
And the Dream Factory.
Exactly. So there's third-party tools like Dream Factory Snapshot. Very good. When deploying via the Force.com IDE, do you have to deploy the full project? No, you do not. So remember, we were able to check those boxes, right? And just indicate a subset of things we'd like to deploy.